Messages sent to the witnesses here in the Mueller probe. One from Mueller and the other from your president. Bob Mueller telling convicts they will be spared prison time if they testify honestly, while Donald Trump has been doing something quite remarkable when you think about it. He's been openly urging witnesses not to testify at all. Mueller sending the message the way he speaks, through his filings, this time the sentencing memo that everyone has been talking about. This lays out what Bob Mueller thinks of guilty Trump aide Mike Flynn, and explains that Flynn has, in the view of the special counsel, provided substantial assistance. And now we know the number of interviews, a whopping 19. And they don't do those interviews just for fun. That means there was a lot of information they wanted to get through. You also see that they argue, this is the special counsel folks, that a sentence of no jail time is appropriate and warranted. Mueller drawing a sharp contrast here between Flynn, who he, of course, says was helpful, and other Trump aides like Manafort and Papadopoulos, who allegedly kept lying after their plea deals. That's according to the special counsel, and who Mueller didn't go as easy on. Another key part of Mueller's filing, what he didn't say. We're going to show you right here. These are entire pages that are just black redacted. Now, that happens anytime there is a good reason to withhold the information from the public. The judge will see what we don't. Meanwhile, Mueller noting Flynn helped several ongoing investigations. That would mean, number one, of course, this special counsel probe. We know that. But then this very tantalizing and really quite vague reference, you can see it on your screen, quote, a criminal investigation, and then that thing. That black strip is something else. We want to tell you it exists, but we don't know anything more than that because Mueller isn't giving us anything more than that. A complete blank. Rudy Giuliani, meanwhile, saying this was a big crime for nothing. Now, Flynn met with Mueller's team a bunch of times, as I was just saying. So there was a lot of information flying around. That doesn't mean all of it is in the new filing, but Mueller wouldn't be recommending zero jail time if he didn't think a lot of it was valuable. So who doesn't think it's a big deal? I'm going to show you this full quote I mentioned. Quote, wow, big crime for a special whatever, Rudy Giuliani's particular Trumpian style of criminal lawyering, and another Trump ally, Republican Congressman Mark Meadows.
I've looked at this report, and yes, everybody's going to focus on what has been redacted. But let's look at what's not in there. There is no suggestion that Michael Flynn had anything to do with collusion. He was with the transition team. He was part of the campaign, and yet there's no mention of collusion. I think it's good news for President Trump tonight that this is what it's come down to.
Now, I want to be clear. It is entirely possible, as we've said before on this broadcast, that there won't be any conspiracy collusion indictment. But what Mr. Meadows says there also isn't provable because the word collusion, well, it could have been mentioned under what I showed you on the screen, what we have in the studio. You don't know what these words are, so you can't really say, if you're a responsible observer or lawyer or congressperson, that this thing doesn't mention any particular word authoritatively. Wanted to put that fact check out there and get right to our experts. I'm joined tonight by former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi, Natasha Bertrand, staff writer of The Atlantic, and Malcolm Nance, an MSNBC terror analyst and author of the book, The Plot to Destroy America. Gene, yes. Bob Mueller speaks deliberately. He withholds information deliberately. And he seems to want us to know there's more that he's not sharing right now, because as you and I know, he could easily have redacted things in a way as an addendum where we wouldn't have seen the redactions themselves at all. What do you think he's doing here in that blended message?
Robert Mueller is playing three-dimensional chess, and the Trump team is playing tic-tac-toe. Rudy Giuliani said this is all butt-kiss. What I say is holy cow. And the number, Ari, that you got to focus on is 19. And you also have to focus on the phrase non-exhaustive list. The 19 refers to what I call the meetings and debriefings. It could be in the grand jury. Those lasted probably about, on average, 3 hours, maybe more. That's about 60 hours of information provided to various parts of the Department of Justice, including probably the tax division where I used to roll. Now, the phrase non-exhaustive list, that's a holy cow for one reason. It's non-exhaustive. That's prong B. That's the Russian investigation. And with the utmost respect to that congressman, I don't think he knows how to read, and he's not a prosecutor. This is an explosive, destructive, brilliant memo that was filed by the Mueller team, period.
Yeah, and Natasha, you don't have to be a lawyer. Again, I'm going to hold it up because this is what we're working with. you don't have to be a lawyer or an expert to say, we just don't know what's under there. We don't know whether what's under there relates to matters of international conspiracy, collusion, election hacking, and that kind of material, and that's why it's so secret, or whether it's about something else entirely. I mean, what we do know is that one of the other things is a non-special counsel thing. It could be a non-political thing, but we just don't know. Based on your reporting and your sourcing, how does what we got line up with all the Washington expectations and what you think is important about it?
Yeah, so obviously we were all pretty disappointed that roughly 60% of the memo is redacted, but it's much more than we expected in terms of Flynn's cooperation with Mueller. I mean, 19 interviews over the course of the year. I mean, the fact that Flynn really hasn't said a word since he began cooperating with the special counsel, this was the culmination of all of that. And it's very clear now that Flynn really sung like a bird. I mean, he made it very clear from the beginning that he was not loyal to Trump. His lawyer came out last year and said, look, Flynn has a story to tell, and he very much would like to tell it if the circumstances permit. But I think there are a lot of clues also in the prosecutors that have been assigned to this case. One prosecutor who specializes in counterterrorism, the other and speaks fluent Arabic, the other who focuses on counterespionage. So that in and of itself can be a clue as to where the direction of Flynn's cooperation may lie, especially due to his dealings with Saudi Arabia and Russia and Turkey in the year before Donald Trump was elected president. He was essentially acting as an unregistered foreign agent. Now, I also don't think that this document means, and according to the experts I speak to, that this means that Flynn's cooperation is over. He still could be helping Mueller with various ongoing investigations. That it's very clear that those investigations are still going on. And it was spelled out right there. So there's still a lot more, I think, to come in the Mueller probe. And anyone who says it's wrapping up anytime soon, I think, kind of got over their skis.
Malcolm, that's the law. Take us through what Natasha mentions, the counterespionage and the national security, because what we're seeing here is the cooperation of an individual, and thus we're seeing more confirmed details about how he lied about efforts essentially to put other countries' interests or business interests above the United States. And he was the person running the national security apparatus for some time, for a brief time.
You're absolutely right. And look at the way Robert Mueller has structured his attack using the Flynn document. Michael Flynn was the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And his dealings with Turkey, with Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi, the Gulf states, all impacted his decisions before the election. And as we know, a lot of this investigation really started with Mike Flynn talking to the Russians 3 to 5 times, before the election in relation to something that he decided to lie to the FBI about. But the document that we're seeing here really lays out a building block case showing this is what Michael Flynn did. And then he came to us after we called him in, pointed this out to us, and like a person with some loyalty left to the nation, he confessed to it all and became the #1 witness on everything. That blank section of the document, all the redactions, are probably everything else that we see that would be leading to the Trump campaign and everything that he knows. We know the ridiculous things with Fethullah Gulen, with Turkey, maybe a little bit about Saudi Arabia, but what we don't know is going to be about Trump.
Let me draw you out on that. I mean, that's sort of the opposite inference of Mark Meadows. And again, I'm not saying I know. I'm just saying I don't know. And I learned a little bit in law school to know what I don't know. Mark Meadows said, well, what's not in here leads him to a positive inference. You're actually saying something, if I can mix a little art history analysis with legal, you're saying that this negative space of the painting could be the worst Russia stuff because it's not the Turkey stuff and it's not the stuff that's already come out. It's the stuff that might relate to where the investigation's heading.
Sure, it has to be. I mean, this is a document that's, the material that's been redacted there is most likely related to the most top secret intelligence and relationships to Team Trump that we have. In particular, the phone communications with Kislyak, who would have authorized that, all of the dirty tricks that Flynn was involved with. None of that was revealed, and we know what happened. So, for the most part, that document is, if from the intelligence perspective, that black holes are the most important part of our collection, because what we don't know, that has to be there, even though we can't see it.
Gene? Gene,
lost my.
your-
Yes.
Gene, I was wondering just your view of what Malcolm was saying, that theory of the redactions, if you heard us.
I totally agree with what Natasha said and Malcolm said. And I got to stress this. Prong C, as I call it. They had 3, A, B, and C. Please, American people, do not assume that prong C is a civil matter. You could have civil and criminal matters parallel. For example, taxes. You could have a civil investigation with a criminal. Don't assume it's only civil. And don't assume that it's minor.
And you're speaking to the third question mark, the other probe. Natasha, I want to play for you a little bit of Donald Trump defending Michael Flynn. This is even after Flynn's guilty plea. Trump, we were seeing, would still be more complimentary than he's been, obviously, to some of his other estranged former aides. Take a look.
Well, I feel badly for General Flynn. I feel very badly. He's led a very strong life, and I feel very badly.
He's been a lawyer for me, didn't do big deals, did small deals. I understood Michael Cohen very well. What turned out he wasn't a very good lawyer, frankly.
Why the difference, Natasha?
Well, I think that the president was largely in the dark about Michael Flynn and his legal strategy for a long time. So he might not have had that kind of perspective on what Flynn was doing like he did with Michael Cohen. I mean, just remember that Michael Cohen was essentially talking to Trump about a potential pardon up until earlier this year. And so Trump kind of had that, he had that perspective on what Cohen was doing. And then when Cohen flipped on him, it may have been a shock. But what Michael Flynn has been doing is he's been cooperating totally in secret over the last year. And I think that has scared the president. Maybe he just didn't want to come out and say, spook him into saying anything else about the Trump campaign's communications with the Russians. It's really hard to get into the president's mind, obviously. But I do think that the people that should be worried also, besides the president, are, Jared Kushner, other members of the transition team who may have spoken to or met with Russian government officials, and that was not disclosed. Kushner in particular is pretty significant because he, of course, met with the CEO of a sanctioned Russian bank, supposedly just as a transition kind of diplomatic thing, but according to the Russians, it was to talk business. So Michael Flynn could shed more, light on that meeting and whether it was nefarious in any way. So I don't think that this is isolated danger just to the president. I think that, anyone who was around him during the transition period is also pretty vulnerable as well.
Stay with me. What I want to do to add to our conversation on the national security is bring in Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters. He's actually known Michael Flynn since the 1980s. And Colonel, let's look. The sentencing memo discusses Flynn's public service, calling it exemplary, certainly courageous. It says senior government leaders, though, should be, quote, held to the highest standards. And someone with his background should have been, quote, particularly aware of the harm caused by providing false information to the government. Your view, sir, given your service of that passage and whether Michael Flynn should have known better, and regardless of the law, which is important, day to day, do you view him as compromising the national security of the United States?
Mike Flynn betrayed his country. He did a lot of good things, but in the end, he betrayed his country. It is unforgivable, even if there's no jail time. And I'm very ambivalent about a lot of this. Lying to the FBI was a crime, but the greater crime was what, to me, in my view, was treason. Embracing the Russians. Should Mike Flynn have known better? Yes, of course he should have known better. But again, for me, having known him.
Let me ask you on that. And as a lawyer, I always note that, treason under the actual legal definition involves a hot war, which we don't even have with Russia. But I take you to be speaking to the broader principle as a veteran, what you think he did vis-a-vis his. Do you think this was a lapse of judgment, of arrogance on the part of Mr. Flynn, that he thought he knew better than everyone? Do you think it was straight up greed, that he was taking money and started to put that above the obligation he had as an officer of the United States, or something else based on the fact that you've overlapped and you know more about this than most of us do?
Well, I've got to stress, though, that his military service was exemplary. He was a guy in our training class in the 1980s. He was a guy you would have picked out as, hey, that man's going to be a general. He's going to be the general. And by the time he got to Iraq and Afghanistan, Mike Flynn performed brilliantly. I mean, everybody made a fuss about Dave Petraeus and his BS counterinsurgency strategy that didn't work anywhere. It killed and maimed a lot of Americans. What Mike Flynn did saved a lot of American lives. I mean, he and Stan McChrystal were the people that turned Iraq around. He was courageous in challenging the old way of doing business in Afghanistan. So he gets points for that. But then when he was a great field soldier. But then when he moved to be director of DIA, a sprawling organization that requires a desk job management skills, it didn't work. He was trying to reform it, some good ideas, some bad ideas. And above all, he was trying to warn the Obama White House about the rise of al-Qaeda. They didn't want to hear it, came to a split. He was basically fired. And at that point, something appears to have snapped in Mike. And he got angry, and he got greedy. And then on top of that, once he connected with Trump, and he started to feel, the magic of the crowds cheering for him and the utterly disgraceful chance of lock her up. I have to tell you, Ari, when I learned that Mike Flynn had embraced the Russians, when I heard those chants he was leading of lock her up, conduct unbecoming by any standard, I don't think I've ever been so surprised in my lifetime by the turnabout in an individual. And so Mike Flynn did many good things. Mueller took them into account. But at the end of the day, he betrayed a trust. And as far as I'm concerned, military officers have to have a higher ethical standard than anybody else. They have to set the example, and Mike failed.
It's very interesting hearing your view, your analysis, and charting that history of, as you say, what you perceive to be a more effective Middle East strategy than David Petraeus' surge, courageous valor in battle, followed by these tremendous errors in judgment. And you mentioned something that we all remember, and that was the entry point for many Americans into understanding anything about Michael Flynn. And for that reason, we'll play it. And Malcolm, I'd love you to tell us your reflection of all this on the other side, whether or not there's jail time. Mueller recommending against it, but this was Mike Flynn once he made common cause with Trump at the convention.
Lock her up, lock her up. And you know why? You know why we're saying that? We're saying that because if a guy who knows this business, if I did a tenth of what she did, I would be in jail today.
Malcolm?
Well, he has done a tenth, more than a tenth of what she was accused of. And to Colonel Peters' point, let me point something out here that I think a lot of you are missing. The very fact that Robert Mueller is only recommending, no jail time on General Flynn tells me something very important. Very early on, within the community, there was a lot of concern that Mike Flynn had been flipped by the Russians, by the money payments that he was getting there, and that he may have actually been working for a foreign government or intelligence agency. That has now been dispelled because the counterintelligence investigation would not have allowed him to go anywhere if he had been even remotely close to that. What he got caught up in is that chant of lock him up. He got caught up in politics.
Right.
And he, as an intelligence genius, to a certain extent, most likely used all of those analytical skills for the Mueller probe to act as a hub to reveal all of Trump's nefarious activities. It's going to be interesting.
It's a fascinating story. It's a classic rise and fall story, but there's nuance there in not reducing him and his whole career to only heroism or only villainy. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.